April 1967, Newat Air Base, South Vietnam. The transport aircraft's ramp dropped into a wall of heat that smelled of jet fuel, damp canvas, and the green rot of jungle that started just beyond the wire. 4 Australians stepped out without ceremony, boots hitting the metal ramp with the dull confidence of men who'd learned not to waste energy on appearances. Their packs were small, so small the Navy SEALs watching from the operations building assumed something had gone wrong. No tall radio antennas, no heavy weapons cases, no crates of ammunition, no tower of gear that American doctrine treated as the minimum price of survival in hostile country. The SEALs exchanged looks that carried confusion and contempt in equal measure. Maybe the real equipment was on the next aircraft. Maybe these were an advance party traveling deliberately light. But there was no next aircraft, no second wave, no missing cargo. This was the loadout. This was the point. Those 4 men in unmarked uniforms that didn't advertise rank or unit, carrying weapons that looked inadequate to Americans raised on fire superiority, weren't arriving to be impressed by American professionalism. They were arriving to quietly dismantle it and rebuild something in its place. The Americans didn't know they were watching their own education walk across the flight line. They didn't yet understand that the men they were dismissing as under-equipped colonials from a military of sheep farmers and surfers were about to demonstrate what a soldier looks like when the training system that made him was built around different questions, harder questions, questions paid for with blood in Malaya and refined in Borneo. The United States military that entered Vietnam in force in 1965 had spent 2 decades becoming the most powerful conventional warfighting machine in human history, and it had done so by institutionalizing the lessons of victories. Second World War, Korea. The method had been overwhelming industrial firepower brought against defined targets in a conflict where the enemy wore uniforms and held ground that could be taken. The principle beneath that method, understand your enemy, understand your environment, align your capabilities precisely to what the situation demands, was more transferable, more permanent, more dangerous to forget. The American military had institutionalized the method and let the principle rot. By the time the war in Vietnam demanded patience, silence, human sensing, and the willingness to operate for long periods without leaving a signature, the system was producing soldiers optimized for speed, noise, and escalation. It wasn't a failure of courage or intelligence, it was a failure of institutional imagination, and no amount of money or determination was going to compensate for it inside a dense jungle populated by an insurgency that had been fighting foreigners for decades. The Australians knew this, not because they were smarter, but because they had already made the mistake and paid for it in blood. The Special Air Service Regiment traced its lineage to the British SAS and the philosophy David Stirling forged in North Africa. Small, highly selected units, maximum autonomy, disproportionate effect. But the SASR that arrived in Vietnam in 1966 was not a museum piece copied from Britain. It had been shaped by 15 years of Southeast Asian jungle counterinsurgency, long-range patrolling, population intelligence, living in hostile terrain without external support, and the slow, unglamorous discipline of watching and waiting. Malaya had been the crucible from 1948 to 1960. Borneo in the early 1960s had refined the lessons against a different enemy in similar country. By April 1967, the Australians weren't carrying fewer things because they lacked resources. They were carrying fewer things because they'd learned what extra things cost you. The joint training program began like most American programs began, with an expectation that knowledge could be transferred through instruction, techniques through demonstration, competence through repetition. The Australians arrived with a different assumption. You could teach techniques, yes, but effectiveness lived in a culture, and culture had to be grown. That gap between what can be acquired and what must be cultivated would become the central discomfort of the entire program. On the second day, in a clearing where the ground was hard-packed and the air hummed with insects, the Australian instructors told the SEALs to empty their rucksacks. The SEALs complied with the confidence of men certain that preparation would be validated. Gear spilled out into neat rows, radios with spare batteries, ammunition in quantities that promised hours of sustained combat, medical kits comprehensive enough for field surgery, rations, water, grenades, smoke, signal flares, climbing equipment, spare clothing, emergency supplies, 80 pounds give or take. It looked like competence made physical. It looked like American institutional wisdom compressed into nylon and metal and plastic. The Australians walked the line without expression. They hefted items, examined them, asked questions about purpose and necessity in voices that didn't accuse but didn't flatter. Then one of them pointed to roughly half of everything laid out on the earth and said 3 words so flat they sounded like a weather report: leave it behind. The protests came fast, and every objection made sense inside the world the SEALs had been trained in. The radio was mission critical for calling air support when engagements deteriorated. The ammunition was survival and sustained contact. The medical kit was the difference between going home and going home in a bag. Every item had been selected through institutional processes validated by operational experience. You did not simply abandon gear doctrine required. The Australian response to every objection was the same question, delivered with a calm that made it more destructive than any lecture. If the enemy knows where you are, what good is any of it? The silence that followed was not the silence of insult. It was the silence of foundational assumptions collapsing. The entire American approach to special operations rested on the premise that superior firepower, made available through technology and logistics, could could compensate for compromised position: get detected, fight your way out, take casualties, call for medevac, request air support, apply reinforcement faster than the enemy can sustain. The solution to every problem was more capability brought to bear quicker. The Australians rejected the premise completely. Compromised position wasn't a problem to solve. Compromised position was the end of the mission, regardless of what you could do afterward. Detection wasn't a setback. Detection was failure. And the 80-pound rucksack wasn't a guarantee of survival. It was a guarantee of detection. They explained it brutally simply. Weight made noise, not only through rattling equipment, but through the heavy footfalls it forced, the sway it created, the exhaustion it produced over miles of jungle that made men stop thinking about silence and start thinking about endurance. The mathematics of weight reduction were not about carrying less for comfort. They were about being less visible, less audible, less present to every sense an enemy had sharpened over 30 years of war. The Australians weren't asking the SEALs to give up capability for sport. They were telling them the capability they thought they had, firepower after detection, was an illusion purchased at the cost of the one capability that mattered most in that environment, remaining unknown. They didn't argue their philosophy into American minds, they demonstrated it. They took 4 Australians into the jungle and told the American teams to find them. The Australians moved at what the Americans would later nickname the SASR Shuffle, a pace so slow it didn't register as legitimate military movement at first. One foot lifted with precise deliberation, hovering while the operator assessed every inch ahead, then moving forward in increments measured in centimeters and descending with full attention to every potential noise source beneath it. Terrain an American patrol would cross in 10 minutes took the Australians hours. The Americans watched, impatient. Slower, they believed, meant more vulnerable, more time in the danger zone, more opportunity for the enemy to detect and engage. The Australians had heard the objection many times and answered it with the same silent cruelty of results. The Americans went in at careful American pace, slower than their normal tempo, but still driven by the instinct that forward motion equaled safety. They searched for signs like men trained to believe the world would advertise the enemy if you were smart enough to look. They didn't find the Australians found them, more than once. The same American team, heads down, scanning for an unseen patrol, suddenly realized they were being watched. A face at close range, a shadow that wasn't a shadow, a man close enough to kill them, calm enough not to. The demonstration required no commentary. You cannot lose a contact that is never made. You cannot be ambushed by an enemy who does not know you exist. And you cannot remain unknown if you move at a speed that makes silence impossible and sound inevitable. Then came the lesson that hit the Americans in the gut, because it exposed how completely their training system had misunderstood the environment. The Australians called it scent discipline. The Vietnamese jungle had an olfactory landscape built from centuries of habitation and agriculture. Fish sauce, rice paddies, tropical vegetation in growth and decay, wood smoke, animal waste, specific soils, specific waters, specific organic compounds. The Viet Cong had grown up marinating in those smells. Their sensory calibration to that world wasn't a learned skill. It was a biological inheritance. And into that world, American soldiers arrived carrying the chemical signatures of industrial civilization: deodorant, shaving cream, boot polish, gun oil, toothpaste, soap. Each compound was foreign as a flare and to a nose calibrated for that landscape as detectable as one. Americans could camouflage their visual signature. They could reduce acoustic signature through careful equipment preparation, but they had not thought about chemical signature at all because no one in their system had told them they needed to. The Australians had learned the lesson in Malaya, paid for it with lives, and built it into doctrine. Days before an operation, they reduced scented products. They rubbed jungle mud into exposed skin and uniforms. They adjusted diet to reduce the compounds the body expelled. They didn't claim they could eliminate scent, no outsider disappears completely, but they could shrink the window of detection from hours to seconds, and those seconds were the difference between operating unseen for days and walking into an ambush you never knew was waiting. Ambush doctrine itself was the next inversion. American manuals specified distance, 50 meters between ambush element and route, because distance meant reaction time, manageable engagement range, options for withdrawal if things went wrong. By conventional logic, it was sound. The Australians practiced at 15 meters. 15 meters was close enough to see expressions, close enough to hear breathing, close enough to smell sweat and food and equipment, close enough that a cough, a sneeze, a muscle twitch after hours of enforced stillness could mean discovery, and a fight at ranges where superior firepower meant less than the first second of shock. The Australians' reasoning was not recklessness. At 15 meters, there were no missed shots. At 15 meters, the engagement ended before targets processed what was happening. At 15 meters, a 4-man patrol could neutralize a column before anyone unslung a weapon. And at 15 meters, withdrawal happened into confusion so complete the enemy could not tell how many attackers there were, where they'd gone, or how to counter them. Conventional ambush doctrine left evidence to be understood and adapted to. The Australian method left behind bodies and fear. But the true separator wasn't distance, it was waiting. Australian patrols would establish positions and remain for days, not hours. Cold rations only, no cooking smells. Containers for bodily functions, no scent markers. Communication by microscopic hand signals. The willingness to let insects bite and snakes slide across skin rather than risk movement. That discipline was not something you could teach in 3 weeks. It was the product of a psychological formation built through selection and culture. Australian SAS selection in the 1960s maintained attrition rates that could exceed 80% across a long selection cycle, and the men cut weren't cut because they couldn't run or shoot. Many were physically capable. They were cut because they lacked the internal architecture the doctrine required: patience without anxiety, restraint without resentment, quiet without the need for validation. A training assessor named Sergeant McDake described it to visiting American officers with a blunt clarity no regulation language could match. They weren't looking for the man who could endure the most. They were looking for the man who had stopped needing the things that made endurance necessary. The man who no longer needed to move to feel safe, no longer needed noise to feel in control, no longer needed confirmation from outside himself that he was making the right decision. That man, he said, took years to grow properly. Weeks could teach the outline. They could not build the core. Tracking instruction exposed the gap between two institutions in the most humiliating way because it was where American technology was most directly outperformed by human skill. American forces in Vietnam relied on aerial photography, ground sensors, electronic surveillance, signal interception, the frontier of mid-1960s military technology applied with enormous resources. And in dense jungle against an enemy raised in that terrain, the technology consistently missed things Australian trackers found with nothing but trained senses and an inherited way of reading land. A bent blade of grass could tell them how many hours had passed since someone walked through. The degree of recovery, the color change in stressed vegetation, the pattern of disturbed insects, compression in leaf litter, all of it told a story about direction, speed, approximate weight, number of personnel. Animal behavior, birds lifting in one pocket while continuing normal activity elsewhere, marked human presence as clearly as smoke to anyone who spoke the language. The Australians' tracking culture had absorbed indigenous traditions of environmental interpretation, refined over vast spans of time, and in Vietnam that accumulated knowledge translated into operational advantage that embarrassed machines. In March 1968, an SASR patrol with a tracker attached located a Viet Cong battalion command element in an area American surveillance and sensors had declared empty. The tracker needed hours. The technology needed weeks and produced the wrong answer. The command element was later destroyed by airstrike. No press release followed. The result was simply recorded quietly as something that had happened and made some men uncomfortable. Captain Mike Walsh, an American special operations officer attached to the program as an observer and assessment officer, documented what he saw in a classified report that circulated through Pentagon corridors like a fever. Walsh was not naive. He came with a mandate to determine how American special operations could replicate what the Australians were achieving. His most quoted passage was also his most honest. He wrote that Americans could purchase Australian weapons, copy their load-bearing equipment, memorize procedures, study doctrine in translation, but none of it would replicate what made the Australians effective because what made them effective could not be acquired. It had to be grown. The distinction mattered. A technique could be transferred, a culture could not. The Australians did teach techniques with patience and generosity, but Walsh could see the gap between possessing a method and embodying the way of thinking that made the method consistent under stress. The results forced a deeper discomfort. Some American teams genuinely committed, internalized the inversion, and improved. After-action reports documented admiration mixed with institutional unease. Techniques could be taught. Some could be learned effectively by Americans willing to dismantle their own assumptions. But consistency remained the problem. The Australians achieved success rates on operations that seemed almost unreal to Americans accustomed to compromise and contact. American teams using the same techniques in the same terrain against the same enemy improved but hovered far below Australian consistency. The gap persisted regardless of training length or individual commitment. Colonel Arthur Bull Simons, who observed the program closely and later became legendary in American special operations, identified the root cause with brutal precision. It wasn't talent, courage, or intelligence. The Americans in that program were among the finest soldiers he'd seen. The problem was that the SASR built its operators over years of continuous selection and refinement inside a culture designed for jungle war. And Americans were trying to build operators over months of intensive courses inside a different culture entirely. The culture was not a wrapper around the technique. The culture was the technique. Separate the method from the culture that produced it, and you get something better than baseline, but never as consistent as the real thing. The Americans who completed the full program described the change in language that sounded more like conversion than training. Before, they saw the jungle as terrain, something to cross, manage, use for cover, overcome. After, they saw it as a system with its own language and conditions for acceptance. The jungle did not accept you because you were skilled. It accepted you because you had stopped imposing yourself on it. That shift, from domination to integration, was the deepest level the Australians operated on, and the hardest to transfer because it required abandoning beliefs the American system had spent years building. The SASR had rebuilt itself from first principles after earlier wars burned wrong assumptions away. The Americans had to dismantle those assumptions while bullets were still flying. The legacy didn't end when Australians withdrew in 1971. It seeded through the American Special Operations community in ways that took decades to manifest fully. MACV's Recondo School incorporated Australian instructors and Australian-derived methodology beginning in 1967, and the units that passed through, especially those led by commanders willing to let doctrine reshape practice rather than bolt it onto existing method, showed measurable improvements even in conservative official accounting. Patrol detection rates decreased, intelligence quality from extended observation increased, contact ratios shifted, more engagements initiated on patrol terms rather than enemy terms. The most dramatic improvements clustered around the same variable again and again: willingness to accept the central demand the Australians made, not new skills, a new relationship with the environment. Later, when Delta Force was formed in 1977, selection ideas and autonomy principles that had echoed through Vietnam-era observations were visible in what America chose to build. Long-range surveillance units adopted patrol techniques that reflected the same logic: small teams, independent action, minimal signature, patience-based intelligence gathering rather than a constant hunger for contact. Official accounts rarely credited the lineage because institutions rarely enjoy admitting they had been corrected by outsiders, but the fingerprints remained in doctrine and in the quiet habits of men who learned, sometimes too late, that in unconventional war the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that hits hardest, it's the one that hits from a position the enemy never knew existed. The Viet Cong understood what the American training system had produced before the American training system did, and they communicated it in a phrase that spread through their networks and made intelligence analysts pay attention: jungle ghosts. They did not give that name to Americans, they gave it specifically to the Australians. The name captured something that after-action statistics could not quantify. The Australians were not simply effective, they were unknown. Their presence was undetectable until they chose to reveal it. Their methods were difficult to counter because they could not be understood. Their attacks materialized from terrain that had been assessed as safe and disappeared back into that terrain, leaving nothing behind except outcomes. You cannot prepare for an enemy you cannot locate. You cannot adapt to a threat you cannot interpret. And you cannot maintain cohesion when your fighters become afraid to trust trails that have been cleared, afraid to rest in positions that have been checked, afraid to believe any assessment of safety because the ghosts have proven every certainty temporary. The Australians did not arrive at Newat in April 1967 carrying exotic secrets. They carried fundamentals any serious examination of counterinsurgency warfare would have identified long before the war reached its crisis. The tragedy was that the American institution had not conducted that examination because it was too confident in its doctrine, too invested in its technology, too proud of its record to acknowledge that a war of rice paddies and jungle trails was exposing the foundation as wrong. 4 men with small packs and no radio antennas delivered the examination anyway, not through speeches but through demonstrations so visceral they rewired men's instincts. What American officers who survived that training carried forward wasn't only a set of techniques, it was the knowledge that the institution that trained them had built them wrong for the war they were fighting. That knowledge is the most consequential thing those Australians brought off that aircraft at Newat, and it is also the knowledge every military institution has the strongest incentive to forget, because admitting it means admitting that victories can teach the wrong lessons, that budgets can buy the wrong strengths, and that the most powerful machine in history can optimize itself away from what matters. In the humid air of Vietnam, under a canopy that turns sound into betrayal and smell into warning, the Australians taught America's elite warriors to think like hunters rather than soldiers, to value the ability to remain unknown above the ability to fight once known, and to understand that in that kind of war, detection is not a setback you recover from, it is the moment you have already lost what you came to do.